So hello everybody and welcome to this webinar called What Works and What's Next? A rigorous look at behavioral nudges in plant-based food system change. This is the fourth webinar in our series Behavioral Nudges in Plant-based or in our series Shifting Food Norms, in which we invite experts on behavior change, culture change, and food systems change to share their ideas and insights. Today I am very excited to have with us Seth Ariel Green. Seth is a research scientist at the Humane and Sustainable Food Lab at Stanford University under the supervision of Professor Maya Mather. He writes Regression to the Meat on Substack and lives in Brooklyn. He's also the co-author of a meta-study that was published in 2025 called Meaningfully Reducing Consumption of Meat and Animal Products is an Unsolved Problem, a Meta-Analysis. Now, Seth, I was both nervous and eager to have you join us for a webinar because I see you as having positioned yourself as a kind of skeptic or critic of defaults as a strategy for diet change, or at least someone who's raising an alarm about why we shouldn't overhype this strategy. And as many know, my organization, BFF, we've positioned ourselves as the developer, scaler, and advocate for plant-based defaults. So I first invited you thinking this might end up being a debate between opposing positions. However, since then, you and I have had several great discussions, and I was surprised to find that you and I actually agree on quite a bit. So then my next concern was maybe we wouldn't have anything to argue about. This would just be a call where we agree about
Yeah, not so
everything.
fun. Yeah.
Um, so I want to start actually by asking you about your experience of meeting me and the Better Food Foundation and our work on defaults. Was it what you expected?
It's a great question. I'm going to tell a little bit of my winding story to having met you.
Yeah.
Um, about 3 years ago, I was working at a cryptocurrency startup that was like kind of EA aligned, but kind of not. And as I saw the door on that closing for many reasons, I decided to do animal stuff because I care about animals. Um, so I started as a hobby this project that you mentioned earlier, this meta-analysis, because I had done some meta-analyses in the past. Um, and eventually that morphed into a job at the Humane and Sustainable Food Lab under the supervision of Maya Mather. And I bring that up to say that my entry into this field is actually pretty recent. Like I really first started getting into this in September 2023. So to your point about what were my prior expectations, at some level I didn't really have any. What actually transpired to get me connected to Jennifer was I have been working with some folks at fine organizations like BITE, Building Impact Through Eaters, um, formerly known as Food for Climate League, and Greener by Default, on some base defaults related interventions. Uh, we are trying to get a school to get on board with a defaults study where we measure what's consumed objectively in terms of default and non-default days at the level of the entire dining hall. And we're also attempting to get to understand the relationship between social norms and defaults. Okay, so that's how I started all this. I dived into my work. And in the middle of that, I emailed someone at GBD a question about food policies at a major retailer in the United States. And that person connected me to Andrew Coriolis at Farm Forward, and Andrew connected me to you. And I believe our first meeting was I just happened to see your name tag at Food Day in 2024. So, like, it was just kind of a lot of serendipity and people knowing other people. And over our conversations, I've learned that I think, I hope I don't speak too much for you by saying this. I think we see the world in similar ways. Like, we care about similar things. We accept that it's hard, that what we're doing is hard, but that it's possible and that we should be doing it. So that's how I came to know you in the first place.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's right, that we do see the world in similar ways when it comes to how difficult it is to achieve social change. Um,
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is that I think if I had been in this field for 10 years, I would have started with the strong presumption that defaults and nudge related strategies were so to speak, the default strategy for the movement. But I did not come in with that understanding because also that might not be 10 years. That might be like the past 3 or 4, the movement has converged on these strategies. But I
Yeah.
didn't know that.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that because being the group that, I see us having spent about 6 years pushing this defaults boulder up the hill to get it to become accepted as a strategy. It's surprising to me that now suddenly people are seeing it as a dominant strategy in this movement for change.
And was it as Sisyphusian as that metaphor implies?
Uh, It felt that way from 2017 to 2022. And since then, it's actually felt like chasing a boulder down the hill. There's
Yeah.
been a lot of enthusiasm, but
Yeah.
part of that, and I think this is partially why you're here, is
Mhm.
that when there's that much momentum, it's kind of hard to control it, right? And so people are going to say inaccurate things, people are going to use the strategy in inaccurate ways, and there is some kind of correction and control that needs to happen to keep this on course. And so I think one of the ways we're aligned is we want to keep this on course so that nudges and
Yes,
defaults are being used the way they're supposed to be used.
that's exactly right.
Yeah.
So
Um, so is it right to say that you're a kind of combination of researcher and advocate? And is there a tension between those two roles?
there can be. So that is right. I would call myself both of those things. In different contexts, I would say I'm a behavioral scientist, or I work at a medical school, or something in that category that gives me like the prestige of Stanford reflected upon me. And in other contexts, I would say I'm part of a movement, and you're part of a movement. So this is our thing that we're doing together. Um, I think in many academic disciplines, it's not uncommon to have people explicitly acknowledge their normative commitments. So I started a PhD once upon a time in political science, and if you read a book about democracy there, it's not going to say also we're indifferent to democracy. No, it's obviously going to be the case that those people think democracy is good, which is why they're studying it. Um, so what we do at the lab I work at is we are the Humane Sustainable Food Lab, which is Maya's invention, is dedicated to accelerating the end of factory farming. How we get there, according to us, or our theory of change, is we do behavioral science and statistical and meta-analytic research. For me, the synthesis of these two things is that all of my theories of the world start with seeing it dead on, looking right at what we see and not what we want to see. Um, the potential conflict is if people's normative commitments to what should be true cloud that. But I would say it's not been that hard for us to sort of stay like start by describing what the world looks like as best we can and build theories that move the world from there. That's where we come from.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's dive into some of
Yeah.
this recent research that you've done with the Stanford Food Lab. You've co-authored a meta-study on plant-based
Mhm.
diet change called Meaningfully Reducing Consumption of Meat and Animal Products is an Unsolved Problem, a meta-analysis. And in it, you analyze 35 research papers, which cover four major strategies to change diet behavior: choice
Mhm.
architecture, persuasion, psychology, and a combination of persuasion and psychology. And you find that in all of these papers, the actual effect on diet change is pretty small. Now, when I heard about this meta-analysis, I was excited because really I wanted to see what you had to say about the papers that the Better Food Foundation has been involved in.
I
You
can
know,
see
we
that. Yeah.
we were closely involved in two papers that your supervisor, Maya Mather, led that were studying defaults in events in universities, and then a third paper with Sodexo and Greg Sparkman and Joel Ginn at Boston College on studying defaults in college and university dining halls. Um, could you tell me a bit about why these were not actually the papers included in your study?
Yeah.
Can you walk us through the inclusion criteria of what you were actually asking in this meta study?
Absolutely. Okay, so at the outset, a meta-analysis is a study where you amalgamate and average the results of other studies. So in some ways, this is the easiest study in the world to do because you don't have to go through an institutional review board. You don't have to like actually collect any original data. You let all the other people do the hard work of designing and running studies, and then you put it together into a blender. There are many different approaches to how to do a meta-analysis. The one we take in this meta-analysis is focused on what do the very best studies, as we define them, say about dietary change with some delay incorporated. So our inclusion criteria were one, everything has to be a randomized controlled trial. That is, treatment has to be either directly under the control of the researcher, like they have to say, Julie, you get the treatment, Seth, you don't, Jennifer, you do, etc. Um, or it has to be as good as effectively random, like a lottery. Second, it actually had to the studies had to measure meat consumption. It could be self-assessed, right? You could say, how much meat did you eat yesterday? But it couldn't be how much meat do you intend to eat tomorrow, or what are your attitudes towards bacon, whatever. All of that stuff is, I don't want to say it's bad, it's fine. It's just not the question we were looking at, which is consumption. Three, that measure had to be at least one single day after treatment began. So that is some pretty minimal standard of, is the intervention still having an effect on you a day later? And four, we only looked at studies that had at least 50 people in total, 25 in treatment, 25 in control. Um, when you do this, if you're me, if you're us, if you ever decide to do this for yourself, you start out with literally thousands of studies and you end up with a few dozen. So like the headline finding right there is just that there just aren't that many studies meeting this criteria because it's really hard. Because measuring meat consumption a day later, like, if you're doing a panel survey or an online survey, recruiting people, even 24 hours later, they drop off. You get like much lower response rates. So I totally get it. The first study you mentioned, the one where Maya is on it, my supervisor, Maya Mather, that one measures effects immediately. So that's a default study that it's at a conference, if I recall,
Mhm.
and you get into the default or the not default group, and then you choose a meal, and then you get the meal. But we don't know what people do at dinner or the next day. So there's no delayed outcome measure. And the Gin and Sparkman paper, I'm happy to talk about that at great length. Um, that just wasn't in our date range. That's actually the simple truth. We would have included that. It just was formally published in Journal of Environmental Psychology in summer 2024, I think. It's a great
Well,
paper. I think we should zone in on this one for a minute.
and it also was really mostly focused on the immediate effects. What meals did a student choose on the day that the default intervention was being used? There was some surveying of student attitudes and how they changed towards food. And the study took place over several weeks, so I guess you could see what
Yeah,
did they eat the next day, but it was all
exactly. But it's
during the
still,
intervention.
that's right. This is a hard thing. Like, do we want to measure effects after the study is over or after it began? We were after it began. That was our criteria. So that would have qualified. Um, because at least maybe like your theory of the world or mine is that you have time to get used to the default. We're not just measuring this one-time thing. You get the default over a whole week. So at that point, we are measuring some sense of like acclimation and like dietary change, even if it's part of your life the whole time.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the places where I think you come across as more of a skeptic or a critic of defaults is on a blog that you wrote in December on your Substack. And the title of that blog is Scaled Up, I Expect Defaults to Reduce Meat Consumption by 1 to 2 percentage points. And you write in your introduction, my view, I expect defaults when scaled up, which means deployed by institutions who aren't mission aligned and without careful supervision by advocates and researchers, to reduce meat consumption about as effectively as everything else by 1 to 2 percentage points. Now, for those
Sorry.
following our research, like the Greg Sparkman and Joel Ginn paper, 1 to 2 percentage points is a lot smaller than the kinds of numbers that those studies typically produce, which is usually a change in consumption around 50 percentage points or more. You go on to explain why your estimate is so low, and you make 5 arguments. I would love to use a lot of this call to just go through those 5 arguments and discuss them.
I
Yeah.
would be very glad to do that.
And your first argument is simply that scaling any intervention is very difficult, and that pretty much every intervention, when you scale it, ends up being less effective than when it's done in a controlled environment. So I just want to make for our audience and our supporters and our funders and allies super clear here. Are you saying that defaults are less scalable than other existing strategies? Are you saying that they're not worth trying to scale?
I do not think, I think the defaults are probably much more scalable in the sense of like dollars per additional intervention unit than almost anything else I would consider. So, like at a micro level, I would say that getting people to watch the documentary Dominion is very effective at getting them to reduce meat consumption a week later. But how the heck are we going to scale that? Like, am I going to like pay AMC billions of dollars to get them to screen it every day or something? Like, I have no idea. Whereas defaults, if you think it's working, you get a partner like Sodexo on board, you actually can just like whoosh, blow this thing up huge pretty fast. So it's actually unusually scalable. My point is what happens, what kinds of effect sizes should we observe when we scale? So this goes back to the Jen and Sparkman paper, um, which I think is best in class in defaults evaluation. And by the way, I'm assuming through all this that everybody who comes to a Better Food Foundation webinar knows what a default is. But I think I'm just going to clarify for a second that what we're not talking about and versus what we are. Um, a default is an intervention. Actually, Jennifer, I'm sorry. Would you like to define a default?
Oh gosh. Well, a default, using the definition we use from the book Nudge by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein,
So ready with that you were.
is it's an intervention in which the desired choice, the choice you want people to make in this place, plant-based food, is what people automatically get if they take no additional action. So you register for an event. If you don't write in that you require a special meal at that event, you're going to get a plant-based meal, but you still have other options. Having something be the default does not remove those other options. It just requires you to take an additional step to say, I choose the chicken option.
Yes. And the reason I clarified that is I also want to say that let's say that you're at a dining station or at a cafeteria and the plant-based option is really close to your face and the meat one is a little further and you still have to choose. I wouldn't call that a default. I would call that positioning or prime placement or something like that. Um, we're talking only about the thing where you have to go through extra effort to get the meat option. So now we talk about Jen and Sparkman. Joel Ginn, Greg Sparkman, 2024 paper, Can We Default to Vegan? Takes place at 3 schools. At 2 of them, the defaults went pretty well. They got the staff on board. As Jennifer has said to me, well, that took a lot of work, right? I think I can say that without disclosing too much, that it takes a lot of training to get people on board.
Yeah, and I'll say here that the 2 schools where that intervention worked very well were schools where the staff had gone through training done by Humane World. So their chefs and their staff had gotten some kind of training in how to think positively about plant-based food and how to cook plant-based food well. That's
Yes.
probably pretty significant.
Yes, and that's an inherently non-scalable thing. Once we blow this up to 400 schools, or rather scale this up to 400 schools, it's much harder to like scale this quality training from Humane World. Um, at the 3rd school, my understanding is that the staff weren't trained that way, and in many ways, I think researchers actually watched them say to students like, "Oh, don't worry, there's actually meat available," or explicitly steer them
Yeah.
towards that.
You won't like that. It has tofu in it.
Yeah. Uh, that sucks. I'm sorry to hear that happened. But my point of view is that when you scale things up, that kind of thing is going to happen often. And so when you measure the effects of scaling something up, it has to include also the places where it didn't go well. If I might make an analogy here, like let's say you want to understand the effects of wearing a N95 mask on COVID, and you can't actually go to people's houses and put the mask on them. I mean, you could, but we're not going to. And so what you actually do is you run an encouragement campaign trying that like says, by the way, here's masks, they're good. By the way, here are 5 free masks, and then you watch how many people put the mask on, and then you track COVID rates. What are we actually interested in this question here? Is it what is the effect of masks, or what is the effect of this policy that gets people to try to wear masks? These are 2 different, here's a technical word, estimands, which is a thing you're trying to estimate. The first estimand, which is the effects of masks, we could call that the treatment effect on the treated, or the complier average causal effect. That is, for people who comply with the treatment, what effect does it have? The other one, we look at the policy encouraging this thing, is called intent to treat, ITT. The reason I'm bringing this up is that when we think about scaling defaults up, I think we need to be thinking about the ITT, not the complier average causal effect, because you're going to tell schools to do defaults, and some of them are just not going to play ball. Um, that's what it means. This is not specific to defaults. This is just how the world works. Once you or me is not there watching every day to make sure that they do the thing right, things don't go as well.
Yeah, and that seems very reasonable. And another factor that can influence the effectiveness of defaults, in fact, this is something that Cass Sunstein talked about on his webinar with us, is that defaults, like really most behavior change interventions, work best on a population that already feels somewhat positively about the change. So if you
Mhm.
have a group of people who generally think, yeah, I want to eat less meat, I want to eat more plant-based foods, they're going to be far more susceptible to being influenced by the default than a population who's resistant to meat eating. And this was something that we saw also at the campus where the defaults didn't work. And, we would need to do more theory, more research to really confirm this. But a really interesting factor was that was the only school that had a predominantly male student body.
Mm.
And we do know that men and people who have an identity tied to masculinity tend to feel negatively towards shifting to plant-based food. So it's not simply that they're being nudged, but they're being nudged towards something that they're like, no, I have bad
Yeah.
feelings about that.
And to presage something that is definitely going to come up later, this isn't just going through their unconscious processes. They're noticing, like, hey, where's the meat? And so are the staff. Um, Jennifer, the thing you're describing here, it's also called site selection bias.
Mhm.
There's a paper by Hunt Alcott on this that's quite good about like where you run the studies where the staff is like the preliminary fact that staff at the other two schools were open to being trained by Humane World tells you something about the kind of place you were running that at, and you might think it's in fact not representative of the world at large.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry.
Now I'll skip ahead because this seems like an interesting topic. I'll skip ahead to your last argument in your
Yeah.
paper, which is really about should defaults be used alone or should they be combined with other interventions? And I'll preface this by saying that all of the organizations that BFF works with on defaults, our own staff, Greener by Default, groups like MFA, have always combined defaults with other interventions like chef training, culinary training, and in fact, realizing the need for these kind of other interventions is one of the reasons we launched the Plant-Based NGO Network last year, so that we can call upon groups who have these other kinds of skills and these other kind of campaigns as needed in order to complement defaults. Um, but I share with you a frustration that certain kinds of interventions uh, don't get maybe enough respect or maybe get neglected.
Or maybe they're really hard to do.
Yeah, or
Anyway, so
maybe
let's,
they're really hard to do. Um, and so I want to ask you a little more about what you think about that. And I'll say that the intervention that I'm most frustrated doesn't get enough respect is ones that connect food and identity, that acknowledge, for example, the role of gender and masculinity, or race and
mhm.
ethnicity, or culture in shaping whether people are going to be open or not to being nudged.
Um, I completely agree. I want to hear shout out this book, Food, great title by Warren Belasco, which Jennifer recommended to me in a previous conversation. This book has two really good chapters on identity and its importance in food, one of which is about the relationship between food and our like core identities, the other of which is about conflicts within our identity. Like, I don't know, I'm a Jewish American man and every Friday night we like had matzo ball soup with chicken broth in it. Like, what does that mean to me? Am I like, do I have a distant relationship to that? Like, stuff's like very mushy in our minds, but it's important.
Yeah.
When I think about staking my position out as a critic or a skeptic or whatever, the thing I'm actually taking issue with, and I think every single paper I've ever going to write in my life could have this subtext, is the idea that this is going to be simple and straightforward.
Hmm.
So you and I think, share an understanding that defaults are just step one. If you read some of the things that some of default's advocates have said, they do not sound like they think it's going to be step one. I am going to name someone in particular. I just want to say I have the utmost respect for this person, and I understand why she said this. Katie Cantrell, the CEO of Greener by Default, once told Michael Grunwald, the journalist, that the whole point that defaults are good because they allow us to bypass the difficult cultural and political fights. Um, my point of view is that they give us a foundation for having those discussions. You make the food, the vegan food, like easy to get, prominently available, and I hope you mentioned this with Cass, make it delicious, make it really good. It's
Yeah.
important, right? If somebody has their first vegan meal and it's terrible, they're gonna think like, oh well, I guess all that vegan stuff was wrong. You do all that, then you're in good shape. Then I think default is a necessary or a really important part of culture change. I'm pushing back against the specific view that we can do this and just be one and done.
Yeah.
Now, I think I'm somewhat like I'm not being totally fair to Katie here. One of the things I really like about this movement is that you all are really smart and you're really thoughtful. And I know that everybody I'm talking to or talking about has thought of this issue, thought about this a lot. Um, it's just, I guess specifically, I'm saying when we scale up, we have to keep doing these other things too.
Yeah.
And these other things are hard to scale inherently because an important conversation about identity and food cannot really, that's one to one.
Yeah. Let me tell you a little bit about how BFF came to be involved in this intervention. One of the starts of this story is with our partner organization, Farm Forward, and a program they started called the Leadership Circle, that was an institutional food consulting program targeting universities, corporations, trying to get them to change their food policy. They were a less and better kind of advocacy group, getting them to reduce the amount of meat they serve and serve better kinds of whatever meat they do serve. And we were facing what was really a primary challenge, which was how to start a conversation at all, right? You approach a
Mhm.
university decision maker and the door is just shut. And so we were looking for potential entry points that would open the door to conversation, not bypass conversation. However, if you show up and you say, hey, we're only going to engage with you if the first step is having a hard conversation about morality and value and ethics and how much you have
Yeah,
to
yeah,
sacrifice,
yeah.
you're not going to have a second conversation. And so we were identifying different, really conversation starters. And once we started advocating for defaults and nudges, it is incredible how many doors opened that never were open to us before. We're seeing this now in invitations to speak at conferences, food service industry conferences that previously had been dominated by meat industry speakers claiming to be the be all end all experts on food and sustainability. And we're getting invited to speak because saying, hey, let's start with talking about what the default should be is a much less scary way to start the conversation. But I completely agree with you. The conversation doesn't end there. Um, but I do think one of the hardest things we have to overcome as a society is this belief that diet change is too difficult to even try, to even
Yeah.
attempt. And so I wonder what you think about, you know, how to lessen that, how to address or overcome that fear that this is too difficult to too scary to even try.
Um, we're leaving research land and we're entering opinion land. So I'm not going to speak as confidently about this,
Yeah.
but I want to circle back to something, your conversation with Reverend Carter from a few months ago
Mhm.
about his identity as an African American man and veganism and the role it plays. Um, and as you said in that conversation, in fact, actually African Americans are the fastest growing vegan segment in the United States, which is very interesting and often surprising to people. So let's see, how would we approach this conversation? The first is to quote something he said, is dispelling this notion that like veganism is this, or plant-based eating plant-based food is this white bougie thing. Uh, I think we can cite a lot of evidence that's not true. You mentioned several. You said like when you go to majority black cities like Atlanta, you see all kinds of vegan places. I'm thinking of Anton Uckles near me or Roz Plant Based in Crown Heights. These are like
Mm.
black owned vegan businesses. Um, so the sense of like, at least speaking in American context, I mean, obviously I can't speak to this like an expert. It's working through pre-existing identity lines, which uh, could also work with like for me as a Jewish person, thinking about like, okay, is there a congregation that is passionate about this stuff? Another, I mean, the actual big thing I want to do, Jennifer, and I don't have any idea how to do this, is actually hit on your word fear and talk about these fears, the things that make people, I mean, I've probably said this before, but it's amazing how quickly when you talk to people about food, you get to something that rhymes with or is directly a reference to a childhood trauma.
Mm.
Even for like affluent, well-off people in my social circle, they'll say things like, "Oh, I feel like I need to have meat because I was as a kid I had to like always fight with my brothers for food." And it's like, let's pause there and talk about that. Like, you're describing something really difficult, the kind of things you have nightmares about 30 years later. And how do I tell people, how do we tell people you're safe now? You don't need to be scared. You can think about your responsibility to others. And I was thinking about this in when I was listening to your conversation with Reverend Carter about his feeling that like being African American in America is very stressful. It like adds a lot of years of stress to your life. So do you have like time and space and energy to think about the needs of others? And I don't know, we're a really rich country. We can afford to think about the needs of others and of our, smallest, most vulnerable inhabitants who, like chicken and shrimp. But that conversation is not, it starts with listening and it starts with compassion. Like I know I'm speaking your language here, everybody, yeah. But I just don't think there's any way around that conversation.
Yeah. Well, I think you're getting at a question I did want to talk to you about, which is there truly this kind of dichotomy between sort of technological solutions, quick fixes, and culture change, the kind of transformation of our attitudes and beliefs and norms? Uh, and I want to put here, my position is that I don't think our work on defaults falls into either category. I think that defaults do shift culture. I think culture is really just a collection of defaults. And if we could shift our default assumptions, shift our default expectations, shift all our norms around food, we've done the culture change. Um, but there are certainly spaces, communities, places where it's more easy or more difficult to acknowledge that this is a cultural thing that's happening. Um, and one of the things we found is that groups, communities that already tie ethics to identity, so this includes kind of ethnic or race-based organizations like the ones Christopher Carter is involved in, faith-based organizations, religious organizations, which, by the way, were the first adopters of plant-based defaults, something else that people don't
Yeah.
always know, uh, might be ready to say, hey, we're already talking about values. So now when we shift the default on our plate, we have a way to kind of manifest this. Um,
And manifest it in a way that doesn't put you in opposition to like the existing flow of things, because that's the whole
yeah,
point of a default, right? Is it's like it becomes the no, the easy flow option
yeah,
forward. Um,
yeah.
so, so what do we want to question about that? Like, I think you and I agree about this. So what
Well,
question might we ask?
here's a question. A lot of spaces in our society seem pretty closed off to acknowledging that values and ethics and morality is important to what we do. There's a lot of spaces, I think, especially in the business spaces and in spaces that are kind of more optimist, who like the word technology and who
I
don't
see
like
what you're
the
saying.
word culture. How do you think we engage with them? Can defaults, can nudges be a door opener into, as you say, the harder conversations with them, or do you think they're just closed?
Hmm. I don't generally think of any of these organizations as truly closed. I think they're talking about morality in terms that might be unintelligible to us, but they are talking about morality. Like I tend to think that, someone who takes very seriously her obligation to maximize shareholder value is in fact expressing a value, even if it's just one that we find very alien. Um, where I thought you were going with this when I thought about technology and culture was more about like well, a couple ways. One of which is, are we paving the way for cultured meat and acceptance of cultured meat?
Mhm.
Like, are people going to buy, like, if and when it's widely available, are people going to eat it? Or are they going to do some of the other stuff that's like, oh, no, I don't eat that. That's weird. So when I think about values in food, I also think about what am I putting in my body stuff. So I'm kind of keenly interested in how are we going to talk to the Make America Healthy movement again, or sorry, Make America Healthy Again movement. Um, because they care about purity. They care about their bodies. Those are not like quite ethical concerns, but they do have the sense that something unethical is happening around them with this like world of people shoveling gross stuff into them and not asking their consent for it. Um, can we talk to them in their terms? So I guess that's my answer to this question is when we talk about people who have a very different value set than us, no, I guess I'm afraid that I do not think nudges are the way there. I think we go conversation first over a vegetarian meal, but
Yeah,
I think in those cases we need to
yeah.
I don't see any way of end running around the actual conversation.
And this might be a point of actual disagreement because
Mm,
I have a theory, and I'd actually love to see this theory tested somehow, which is that people who have regularly experienced eating good plant-based food or seeing it eaten around them are more open to the moral issue. I think that frequently
yeah, it's just
uh, uh,
normalization.
people come up with rationalizations to justify what they already do. So a person who has recently eaten some plant-based meals in some context where they were kind of socially encouraged to, then encounters a message, hey, plant-based food is better for the environment. And now they think, hey, maybe I'm an environmentalist now. I can feel good about being an environmentalist because I already eat this way. Whereas if they had never eaten plant-based food recently, they might think, no,
Yeah,
that argument doesn't justify my lifestyle.
how do they even, yeah, okay, so then the question is like, do we want to, this is a hard question, Jennifer.
Oh yeah, yeah. But I think it gets kind of to the core about normative strategies like
Yeah.
defaults and how they're different from persuasive strategies.
In some ways we're talking about like just ordering, and in some ways you could say like, oh, that's not that important, but it is important because for an organization like BFF, it's like, what are we doing? Like, what are we focusing on? Where are we directing we're like, what are we asking donors for money for? And for me, it's like, where are we directing our efforts? Huh.
And we don't have to have an answer to this, but I
Yeah.
think this is kind of one of the fundamental questions in the advocacy space right now. And it's not either or, but
Yeah.
it's how much effort do we put into changing the norms so that people are kind of more accustomed to or more accepting or less resistance? How much effort do we spend on decreasing resistance to plant-based diet change versus how much effort do we spend on kind of persuading and promoting plant-based diet?
Okay. Well, then I guess the actually, if I were going to put you on the spot here, I would ask like, what went wrong in the culture in America from like 2017 through 2022 approximately. There was a big effort to introduce plant-based and blended foods to places like Sonic, Pizza Hut. You had all these like Beyond specials. There was used to be a Beyond like a really
Yeah.
good plant-based thing at Wawa they took away. That hurt my heart.
Yeah.
What happened? Okay, so
Yeah.
that was the theory. Is it that we failed to have that conversation building on that?
Well, first of all, this is not my deep area of expertise, but I want to argue that as an advocate, right? I'm not an investor in plant-based food companies. I understand it might be disappointing as an investor that a lot of the expectations of this growth went away. But as an advocate who cares a lot about narrative change, I'm like, whoa, there was a period of time there in which tons and tons of Americans who had never thought about plant-based food, never been exposed to plant-based food, probably tried a Beyond Burger for the first time.
Yeah.
And I ended up in a lot of conversations with like old white men who were like excited to talk to me about animal
Huh.
advocacy because they had just eaten a Beyond Burger for the first time in their life. And they just thought that was kind of curious and interesting. I,
Yes, if I
I'm
were going
I'm
sorry.
not the person to say hey, we spent too much or too little as a society on achieving that kind of normative shift in what they're open and willing to think about. But it felt actually pretty significant to me.
Yes, and that's I agree with that. And so if we're going to update our beliefs in light of that, I think we should also update in light of the it didn't work as well as we might like part. So I think, okay, if I was going to run an intervention to nudge people towards having the Beyond Whopper at Burger King, sorry, I forgot the name of a restaurant that will surprise you. I don't go too often. Uh, I guess the first thing I would do is I would say, like, can we make it 25 cents cheaper than the regular Whopper? Even a
True.
small difference might make it very salient. It could be 10
Yeah.
cents cheaper, just enough to be
Yeah.
like, this is the, although you don't want to make it seem like the budget item. Um, then you might think about just like little things that go through, like if you're ordering online or do people order Burger King online, whatever. You say like, try, you could like promote it a little bit and see what happens. I think maybe one way to reconcile these two points of view is to say that the advent of plant-based products in fast food, maybe it wasn't supported by the kind of, advocacy and pushing that it could have made it actually work. What they did instead was they basically just introduced it to the menu naively with just like, oh, now it's part of the menu. Although I think Burger King did do some advertising. Um, my colleagues Jessica Hope and Jacob Peacock and Maya Mather and I have we did an online study where we tested introducing a novel plant-based meat alternative into a Chipotle-like menu. We found that each additional option by itself, just having more of these plant-based options, moves consumption by, you guessed it, about 1 to 2 percentage points. Um, this 1 to 2 percentage points thing, I could cite like 16 studies that all find basically that when you like at scale. So that's kind of where that worldview is coming from. Um, but one way to reconcile our positions here, I think, Jennifer, is to say putting it on the menu is like the weakest nudge possible.
Oh, I
That's the
agree.
Yeah, that's like the bare minimum. Then, like, if you talk to folks at Byte, shout out to Ting Ting who's on this call, you would say, like, they would talk about ratios. They would talk about making plant-based the majority of the options, or they would talk about things that, like, put a little to Greg Sparkman's research program, put a sign under it that says this is a healthy option. A
Yeah.
lot of your peers like this, or like, you know, show a picture of somebody you find admirable eating it.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons, and again, this is a theory, and I would love to see more study into this, in why plant-based food has increased so much in Black African American communities and some other BIPOC communities, is that it is presented in a way that makes it really accessible. It's connecting with something people already care about. It's at the places people already eat. It is affordable. It is tasty. It's popular. It's not presented the way plant-based meat options are often presented as a more expensive elite option for that one person in their group
Yeah.
who has a weird health trend.
Jennifer, if and when you're in New York, you and I think Grace and Danger should all go to Aunt and Uncle's in the Flatbush section of
Mm,
Brooklyn. They do like soul food. It's really good. There's lots of like this is happening. The point is, how can we accelerate it? That's what
yeah,
we're working on.
yeah. I think this
Isn't
is a
that?
great time to shift to some of the questions
Gonna ask.
from the Q&A in the chat. Um,
How do I? Oh, okay. Dismissed. Open. My name. Hi, Calvin. We got Calvin, Grayson, and Karen. Um, Maybe I'll just read them and
please, yeah.
respond. Okay,
Hmm.
so we got Calvin who asks, I have a question about the lab strategy. Since default options are most powerful nudges, how does HSFL work with large food companies to make plant-based the standard choice rather than just a special alternative? Um, hey, Calvin, good to hear from you. We've corresponded before. We are not that. This is hard. What you're describing is very hard. Like this, if you're asking, we would like to do this? Yeah, we'd love to do this. But I just want to say, I read an article recently whose name is escaping me. It was like lessons in food service cooperation. And it said like building relationships with these companies, like with grocers or grocery stores, takes decades. It can take decades. So we're still building those relationships. We're still a pretty new lab. But definitely a big focus for us is like forging those connections and finding interested partners. My colleague Jessica Hope, who's on this call, is very good at this. She's been working with like an empanada reseller in California to do this. Okay, this one I think is more of a Jennifer question. It's from Grayson. Is there any data on faith-based organizations and defaults in terms of impact scale, in terms of how long the intervention sticks? If not data sets, then some good case studies.
Yeah, case studies, right? Not sort of long-term data. But two organizations have been really active in getting faith-based organizations to adopt plant-based defaults. One is an organization called Creature Kind that works in Christian groups, and another is the Center for Jewish Food Ethics, which works in Jewish groups. And so they'll have, examples of congregations, theology schools that have adopted plant-based defaults. And one thing we'd like to do at the Better Food Foundation is we've been keeping a record of, anytime an organization adopts defaults, we do need to go back and follow up and ask them, how has this gone, and collect case studies. I mean, it's really just the labor of that effort that's prevented us from doing it thoroughly, but that's on our agenda.
Cool. Um, Karen asks, in addition to typing some things that I think were intended for a different audience, how can we shift people out of flight, fight, freeze, fawn, or shut down around shifting their diet, especially when people face micro traumas, polarization, and loss of social connections as they move away from traditional Western diets? And when eating animal-based comfort foods have become a way to comfort themselves. Yeah, that's all true. Uh, is there any work being done on nervous system regulation around plant-forward, plant-based dietary shifts? Uh, I don't know. Is there?
I can't answer the nervous system regulation question, but I can say that I think that too often when we advocate for diet shifts, we unintentionally do so in a way in which we're telling people to go against their culture, go against their identity, go against their kind of comfort zones. And we don't need to do that. So, for example, some of the recent interesting work around how we talk about food is protein, right? We know that, a point of resistance is men and the masculinity movement and the idea that you needed a lot of protein. Now, you could argue against that and you could like say, hey, this is just misogyny in food form and convince someone of that, blah, 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 blah. Or you could say, okay, I'm not going to challenge your sense of masculinity, but I'm going to tell you that you can get more and better protein from plant-based sources. And so that's a way of kind of going with what someone's already comfortable with, what their
Yeah.
identity already is. Same with culturally based cuisines, instead of saying, hey, you need to stop eating your comfortable ethnic cuisine in order to eat food from this other culture, like how can we direct people to sources of great plant-based food that are already part of their culture?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a really tough question that Karen's asking. Like,
Yeah.
um, we, like the part of people face these traumas, polarization, and loss of social connections. I wouldn't call those traumas micro. I'm harkening back to something that Vasil Sinescu said to me at the Reducitarian Summit in October, which was like he gets his students. He's a professor at a school in Georgia whose name is escaping me. Has a student watch the movie Earthlings, which is very upsetting, and then finds that 2 weeks later, none of them are still vegan, even if they were very upset by it, because it's like it's faded. Their life moves on, and they don't have this sense of like a group they can eat vegan with. Um, if I had $1 bajillion, I would fund something like this. Like first you watch the movie and then you get people and then follow it up with a bunch of defaults, like make sure vegan food is available. This, I think, is the synergy I'm most excited about. Um,
I'll add, I think we also, uh, uh, I remember being vegetarian in college, and I remember there being this period of time where I was like, I only purchase and eat plant-based food at home, but like when I'm out with my college friends or when I'm on a trip, I eat what's served to me because it was so anxiety provoking to think that, my relationships with people might be harmed if I don't eat the food that we serve them. And I think as advocates, we need to celebrate all the ways in which people shift from animal products to plant-based food. Uh, and so if that means they're just doing it at home, if it means they're just doing it in certain settings but not others, that's still a shift. And so getting into a kind of mentality where it's the overall reduction of animal products in our food system that we're trying to achieve rather than kind of sort of perfect commitment to a diet, I think makes it a little easier for people to say, I can be part of this shift,
yeah,
but I don't need to skip Thanksgiving dinner with my family.
yes. I mean, this is another way in which like I and the Lab of Matter are very well aligned because I would say we're not like good. Good is good. Perfect. Don't need to worry about perfect. I
Yeah.
want people to eat less meat in general. If they say like, I can't live without Thanksgiving turkey, we say like, all right. This is the conversation I want to have with people about
Yeah.
like, how can we support? Two more questions. Ani asks, there are some people who more or less you could take meat away from their plate and they're not even going to notice. They're just like, nah, they're just like, whatever, I eat in front of me. Ani mentions their brother, uh, my best friend and brother. They eat what's in front of them. My intuition, there's a lot of people like that. What does the research say? I don't know. I'm afraid I do not share your intuition. I think most people I know, food is very meaningful to them. Any thoughts on that, Jennifer?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this was, one of the things that we talked about, are food choices automatic? Is it something people do sort of unconsciously just because they're used to it? And it's convenient? Is it reflexive? Is it something we give a lot of thought to? Or is it, I want to say there's also this third thing. Food is very identity based, which is not completely reflexive. If I'm like, hey, I'm Brazilian and I eat this way and I'm not going to stop eating like a Brazilian, like there is some thought to that. Like there are ideas behind that. It is somewhat reflexive, but it's also a little bit automatic, right? It's
Yeah.
kind of a combination of the two. And I
I
think
mean, yeah.
often people's food decisions are really connected to their sense of I'm the kind of person who eats this way.
Yeah. And well, the way to synthesize these is to say like, have you ever spent one of those, had it spent any time on the vegan subreddit, Jennifer?
Very briefly.
Okay. It's a very angry place. This will shock you. They do not approve of people who eat meat. And of course, neither do I. I think it's bad, but like, I try not to do my grimacy thing when people are actually eating their steak. Like, is there some way that we can say like, oh, if you like steak, you will probably also like this other product, like this seared tofu. Um, um, I Julie, I see one more question. So last question I see is from Noel Garwick, which is Sam Cass argues in the last summer, the food system movement has very rarely engaged with traditional marketing firms. Have we done that? Um, and if not, do we know of other groups that have done so? I don't know. How about you?
I can say a little to this. If you're really interested in marketing, there are a number of organizations right now that are connected to the Plant-Based Food Network that we talk to regularly that basically want to do a better job of applying the professional skills of the field of marketing to animal advocacy. But there's also a limit that I frequently encounter when we work with professional marketers outside of this movement is they bring with them a lot of assumptions, a lot of norms, a lot of kind of language norms around talking about food that normalize and centralize meat and make plant-based food seem weird. So when we work with outside marketers, we need to do a lot of like retraining of them around what their own food assumptions are and food norms are.
Yeah. And someone from Monica Levin from PETA weighs in to say that, in fact, PETA is working on this. So I'm glad someone's working on this.
Yeah.
Um, One time when I was talking about how good the study Dominion is to my family, my Uncle Howard was like, "Have you just reinvented the principle that some marketing is better than others? Like, doesn't everybody know that?" And I was like,
Yeah.
"Yeah, man. I guess I'm not that. I don't have anything really original to say. I think that's probably right." Um, I think some of our best work has gone into, or I guess I would push this back to say like, Noel, I'm sure that Beyond and Impossible have engaged the best firms in this question, and it's actually hard to convince people to shift. If it weren't hard, these companies would be worth $1 trillion.
Yeah. And I'll add, if it's all about how much money you spend versus how much meat the meat industry spends, they're always going to spend more. I think advocates who are trying to change the culture, we need to find tactics that are cheaper, that can achieve a big change for less. I know, Seth, you don't like the idea of big changes for little actions, but
I
given
would love it if it were
how
true. I love
given
it.
how much we're being outspent, I think it
Yeah.
behooves us to try to identify ways to get ahead that don't require us to spend as much as the industry does.
Yeah. Well, that's our hour. I'm
Yeah.
not busy. I could talk to anybody, but yeah.
Well, why don't we formally wrap up this call and we could stay on and answer some questions from folks who want to. But I want to thank you, Seth, for your time, for all your writing on this.
Thank
Uh,
you. I
and I
want
look
to
forward to more conversations.
Yeah, and because my concluding note is I feel so very grateful to be part of a movement where we can talk about these things. Like I feel very certain that we all really care about getting the answer right, which is what we're
Mhm.
trying to do.
Yeah.
And I'm really grateful that that's our shared attitude.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Seth. And thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks, folks.